The quiet hum of a Detroit auto repair shop could not have been more misleading. Darrell D. Miles, known in his community for his inexpensive repairs and kind-hearted nature, was an integral part of the neighborhood. His reputation as a reliable mechanic, willing to lend a hand to anyone in need, made him a beloved figure. But one fateful day, everything changed. A burned-out car linked to a missing banker was found in Darrell's garage. The vehicle was untraceable, scorched beyond recognition, but it didn't take long for investigators to connect it to the disappearance of Victor Hill, a prominent banker who had vanished without a trace a week earlier. The location of the car was undeniable. It was Darrell's shop. The police, acting on circumstantial evidence, moved quickly, and soon Darrell found himself in handcuffs, charged with murder. For a community that had long trusted him, the arrest sent shockwaves through the streets. Darrell's arrest was not just a case of a man caught in the wrong place at the wrong time. It was the beginning of a mystery that would unravel a series of secrets too large to ignore. But was Darrell truly guilty, or was something much darker at play? The investigation into his arrest would uncover a tangled web of corruption, deceit, and stolen vehicles. A world far removed from the simple, hard-working life Darrell had known. As the case against him grew, his family's unwavering belief in his innocence would clash with a system bent on making someone pay for a crime. The deeper the investigation went, the more the truth seemed to slip further out of reach, revealing a case that was far from straightforward. Darrell Miles was a fixture in his Detroit community, a man who had spent decades earning the trust of his neighbors and fellow workers. Operating a modest auto repair shop in a city with a rich history of industry and innovation, Darrell wasn't just known for his skills with engines and transmissions. He was also a lifeline for many in need. His reputation extended far beyond the grease-stained overalls and tools that filled his shop. For those who couldn't afford high-end repairs, Darrell's services were a godsend. But Darrell wasn't just about fixing cars. He fixed problems. Whether it was a broken-down car in need of quick repair or a neighbor who needed a favor with no questions asked. He was the kind of person people turned to when they didn't know where else to go, the kind of person who stayed late to make sure that the work was done right, without charging an arm and a leg. For him, it wasn't just about the work, it was about the relationships he built and the people he helped. Despite the humble nature of his business, Darrell's reputation was well known across the city. He had built a network of loyal clients who, over the years, became more than just customers. They were friends, partners, and family. His shop was a place where the community came together, where people shared stories, laughed, and even sought advice. He was well-liked, well-respected, and above all, trusted. However, this sense of trust was about to be shattered in the most profound way imaginable. Darrell's arrest, coming so suddenly and without warning, seemed to defy everything his community had come to know about him. The shock rippled through Detroit's tight-knit neighborhoods, where many struggled to accept that someone like Darrell could be implicated in such a dark and tragic crime. For his family, the injustice of it all was even harder to bear. They knew him, they loved him, and they believed, no, they knew, he was innocent. Yet, as the investigation continued, The walls around Darrell seemed to close in. As the story unfolded, one thing became clear. The case against Darrell was far more complicated than anyone had first realized. It wasn't just about a burned-out car or a missing banker. It was about a much larger conspiracy, one that involved corrupt lenders, stolen vehicles, and falsified evidence. The more they dug, the more it became evident that Darrell was a pawn in a much darker game. Stay with us as we dive deeper into the layers of this case, revealing what truly happened behind the scenes. If you want to know more about Darrell's journey, his family's fight for justice, and the shocking truths that will leave you questioning everything, make sure to subscribe to Beyond the Evidence. Join us as we uncover the untold story, one piece of evidence at a time. Your support means everything as we continue to explore these cases that deserve the truth to be known. Darrell Miles' life was defined by the relationships he fostered with those around him. In the heart of Detroit, his auto repair shop was more than just a business. It was a gathering place for the community, a space where people came not just for repairs, but for connection. For Darrell, the ties he shared with his neighbors and family were what truly mattered, and these bonds shaped the man he had become. His wife, Tanya, was his constant support. Together, they had built a life grounded in trust and mutual respect. As Darrell's business grew, so did their family, and Tanya was not just a wife, but also a partner in every sense of the word. Their love was a quiet, steady force that anchored Darrell through both the best and the most challenging times. Tanya believed in her husband with a depth that only time and shared experiences could create. She was the one who often handled the books, kept track of the shop's appointments, and made sure everything ran smoothly. Their partnership was unshakable, and the thought of losing him, especially for something he hadn't done, was unbearable. Then there was Darrell's younger brother, Marcus. Growing up under the same roof, the two had always been close. Marcus looked up to Darrell, not just as a sibling, but as a mentor and protector. While Marcus had his own life, working in construction, he often stopped by the shop to lend a hand. He was the kind of brother who would drop everything to help Darrell, just as Darrell had always done for him. When Darrell was arrested, Marcus was one of the first to voice his disbelief. To him, the idea that his brother could be involved in such a heinous crime was inconceivable. He knew Darrell better than anyone, and the charges made no sense to him. Beyond family, Darrell had a vast network of friends, many of whom were like family. His shop had been a second home to countless people over the years, many of whom had little but always found comfort in Darrell's kindness. There was Raymond, a former mechanic turned local delivery driver, who would often come by just to chat about the state of the world or to discuss the latest in Detroit's automotive scene. Raymond, like many others, was immediately skeptical of the accusations against Darrell. To him, Darrell wasn't just a mechanic. He was a symbol of trustworthiness and integrity in a city that had seen its fair share of deceit. But as the case unfolded, it became evident that Darrell's relationships, especially with those closest to him, would be tested like never before. His arrest cast a shadow over everything, and the public's perception of Darrell, once so positive and unwavering, began to erode. In a city where trust was a fragile commodity, Daryl's innocence became harder to believe with each passing day. Media outlets fed the narrative that Daryl was a suspect, and even his closest friends began to question what they thought they knew about him. It was a painful process for his loved ones, who couldn't reconcile the man they knew with the man being accused of murder. Through it all, Tanya remained resolute, holding on to the belief that her husband was innocent, even when the walls of suspicion closed in on their family. She rallied behind him, tirelessly fighting to clear his name, but even she had her doubts, hidden deep within her heart. She knew Daryl was a good man, but the mounting evidence was impossible to ignore. The tension between trust and doubt grew, and as Daryl's defense began to unfold, the true strength of his family's love and loyalty was put to the test. As much as the investigation threatened to tear their world apart, it also revealed the deep wells of resilience and conviction within Daryl's family and friends. They wouldn't stop fighting, not until they were certain they had uncovered the truth. But the deeper they went, the more they realized that the truth might be harder to find than they ever imagined. The quiet of Daryl's shop was shattered one afternoon when the police arrived, their unmarked cars pulling into the gravel driveway with an urgency that sent ripples of unease through the neighborhood. At first, no one thought much of it. Daryl had always been a respected figure in the community, someone who had helped countless families keep their cars on the road. His reputation was built on trust, not criminality. But the sight of officers entering his garage, the flashing lights that now surrounded his normally peaceful workspace, something was clearly wrong. The first inkling that something wasn't right came when the burned-out car was discovered. It was found in Daryl's garage, a shell of what it had once been, its make and model barely recognizable. There were no immediate signs of foul play, but the circumstances surrounding the vehicle were enough to raise suspicion. A missing person, a prominent banker named Victor Hill, had been reported just days earlier. He had vanished without a trace, his disappearance already a source of alarm across the city. Then, the police linked the burned-out car to Hill's last known whereabouts. The connection was unsettling, and it quickly became clear that Daryl's shop would be a key location in the investigation. From the outset, the evidence against Daryl seemed circumstantial. There were no fingerprints, no direct link to the crime. But it was enough. The car had been found in his possession, and that was all the police needed to bring him in. Daryl's arrest felt like a slap in the face to those who had known him. For the community, it was almost impossible to reconcile the man they had trusted with the man now accused of murder. But the weight of the accusation bore down on him, and suddenly, Daryl's life was upended in the blink of an eye. The warning signs had been there even before the car's discovery, but no one had seen them. Daryl's business, once thriving, had begun to struggle in recent months. The economic downturn had hit the city hard, and with it came an increase in shady financial dealings. There were rumors in the neighborhood, small whispers about a network of corrupt lenders operating under the radar, offering high-interest loans to those desperate enough to accept them. Vehicles were being repossessed at an alarming rate, and some even claimed that cars were disappearing from neighborhoods, only to reappear elsewhere, often sold for a fraction of their true worth. While Darrell was never directly tied to these rumors, his involvement with a few of the local businesses that serviced these lenders was enough to raise eyebrows. Some believed that his shop was simply another player in the city's underground economy, someone willing to look the other way in exchange for quick cash. His shop had seen its fair share of suspicious vehicles coming in for repairs, vehicles with questionable documentation or untraceable histories. But Darrell had always maintained that he was just doing his job. He was, after all, a mechanic, not a detective. And when the money was tight, he had to take whatever jobs came his way. But the deeper investigation would reveal that the network of corrupt lenders was more than just a shadowy undercurrent to the city's financial woes. It was a systemic problem, one that reached far beyond Darrell's shop. The authorities quickly began to piece together that the missing banker, Victor Hill, had likely become entangled in the same corrupt web of loan sharks and stolen vehicles that had slowly started to consume the city. Hill had been caught up in a high-stakes game of fraud and financial manipulation, one that involved much more than just a missing person. The real story was far more insidious. As the investigation unfolded, the police uncovered evidence that the car found in Darrell's garage was just the tip of the iceberg. Hill's disappearance wasn't an isolated event. It was part of a larger pattern of financial crimes, many of which had been covered up by falsified documents and stolen vehicles. The deeper the investigators dug, the more it became clear that Darrell was, at worst, a pawn in a game much larger than he could have ever imagined. And yet, despite the mounting evidence, Darrell's arrest was a catalyst, one that forced his family, his community, and his defense team to confront a truth that they hadn't yet realized. The real criminals were still out there, hiding in plain sight. As the investigation into Darrell Miles deepened, so too did the layers of deception and corruption that had quietly taken root in Detroit. What began as a routine case of a missing banker and a burned-out vehicle quickly snowballed into a sprawling network of financial malfeasance, stolen cars, and falsified documents. The more the authorities dug, the more they uncovered a pattern of criminal behavior that stretched far beyond Darrell's repair shop and implicated some of the city's most influential players. Darrell's arrest was only the beginning. As investigators focused on the missing banker, Victor Hill, the pieces began to fit together with alarming precision. Hill had been deeply involved in a circle of corrupt lenders who had been operating under the radar, preying on vulnerable Detroit residents with predatory loans and shady financial practices. But it wasn't just the lenders who were complicit. A network of individuals connected to the automotive industry had been actively participating in a sophisticated operation of stolen vehicles, altered VINs, and fraudulent sales. Darrell's name came up repeatedly in the investigation, but it was clear that he had been merely a small cog in a much larger machine. His shop had, unknowingly to him, become a hub for the laundering of stolen vehicles, cars that were purchased on the black market and then fixed up and sold under false pretenses. Darrell had always assumed that the vehicles coming through his shop were legitimate, but as investigators began to connect the dots, it became clear that his business had become entangled in a much darker game. The more the police uncovered, the more Darrell's involvement appeared to be more of a result of his proximity to the corrupt activities than any intentional wrongdoing on his part. But that didn't stop the authorities from framing him as a key player. The evidence against him mounted not in the form of direct proof, but through circumstantial connections, vehicles with altered VIN numbers found in his garage, questionable transactions tied to his business, and customers whose backgrounds didn't quite add up. Yet, despite the mounting evidence, a sense of disbelief lingered in the minds of those who knew Darrell. His family and friends couldn't understand how the mechanic they trusted could be involved in such a conspiracy. Tanya, his wife, watched in horror as the world she knew began to crumble around her. Darrell was a man of integrity, she believed, and yet here he was, at the center of a web of deceit. Her determination to prove his innocence only grew, but she couldn't help but wonder, was Darrell just an unwilling participant in a criminal underworld he didn't understand? As the case grew, so did the pressure. Darrell's defense team, led by a young and determined public defender, began to peel back the layers of the financial and automotive web that had entrapped him. The deeper they dug, the clearer it became that Darrell had been caught in a game far beyond his control. The more they learned about the network of corrupt lenders, the more they realized just how far-reaching this conspiracy was. It wasn't just about Darrell or even Victor Hill. It was about an entire system built on exploitation, where the lines between the legitimate and the illegal had become dangerously blurred. Darrell's role in the scheme, however inadvertent, had become a symbol of the larger issue at play, a broken system where everyday people, struggling to get by, were preyed upon by those in power. And as more evidence came to light, it became apparent that Darrell wasn't the mastermind behind the operation. He was simply another casualty of the city's systemic corruption. The investigation was far from over. With each new discovery, the scope of the crime expanded, and the stakes grew higher. For Darrell, the hope of clearing his name seemed increasingly distant as the case against him continued to build. Yet, in the midst of the chaos, there was one undeniable truth. The more the authorities uncovered, the more it seemed that the real criminals, the ones who had orchestrated this vast conspiracy, remained free, hiding behind a veil of falsified documents, stolen cars, and dirty money. The investigation had only just begun to scratch the surface. The arrest of Darrell D. Miles sent shockwaves through his family and the community. For Tanya, Darrell's wife, the news was an unbearable blow. She had always known him as a hard-working, dependable man, someone who would go out of his way to help those in need. The idea that he could be involved in something so dark, so criminal, was simply unfathomable. But as the media frenzy grew, so did the mounting pressure on her. It felt as if every corner of her life was now under a microscope, and she found herself forced to defend not just her husband, but the very essence of what she believed to be true about him. Darrell's arrest came with a barrage of media coverage, sensational headlines casting him as the key figure in a network of corruption and crime. The local news stations repeated his name over and over, linking him to the conspiracy of stolen cars and fraudulent loans that had plagued the city. To the public, Darrell's image as a respected mechanic seemed at odds with the accusations leveled against him. But for some, that didn't matter. In a city battered by economic hardship, a man like Darryl, a local business owner, a man who helped his neighbors, was suddenly framed as a symbol of betrayal. People who had once trusted him began to doubt him. The whispers spread, and soon even those closest to him found themselves grappling with the same question. Could Darryl really be guilty? While the public wrestled with their own doubts, Darryl's family, especially his younger brother, Marcus, refused to accept the charges. Marcus had always looked up to Darryl. He had seen the sacrifices his brother had made over the years to build a good life for himself and his family. The thought of his brother being part of such a scheme was something Marcus couldn't accept. He stood by Darryl, refusing to believe that the man he had known his entire life could be involved in such a web of corruption. But as the investigation progressed, even Marcus felt the weight of the evidence growing heavier. The stolen cars, the falsified documents, the connections between Darryl's business and the corrupt lenders. It all seemed too much to ignore. Yet, his loyalty never wavered. Marcus was determined to stand by his brother, even as the world seemed to turn against him. For the community, the arrest was a painful reminder of how easily trust could be shattered. Darryl had been a pillar of the neighborhood, someone people could rely on in times of need. And now he was accused of something far darker than anyone had imagined. Many questioned how they could have missed the signs. Was Darryl really involved in something criminal, or was he just another pawn in a much larger game? The uncertainty left a cloud over the neighborhood, and the once solid reputation Darryl had built began to crumble. As the investigation continued, Tanya fought tirelessly to clear Darryl's name. She worked with his legal team, combing through the details of the case, trying to find something, anything, that would prove his innocence. But with each new revelation, the case against Darryl grew stronger. Stolen vehicles linked to his shop, falsified financial records tied to the corrupt lenders. The more evidence the prosecution unearthed, the more it seemed that Darryl had been unknowingly swept into a criminal conspiracy. Tanya's belief in her husband's innocence remained unshaken, but the mounting evidence made her question how much she truly knew about the man she had spent her life with. The immediate aftermath of Darryl's arrest was filled with confusion, fear, and disbelief. Tanya's fight to maintain a sense of normalcy for their children became increasingly difficult as the weight of the accusations hung over them. For Marcus, the emotional toll was profound. He wanted to believe that his brother was innocent, but the facts were becoming harder to ignore. For both Tanya and Marcus, it was a painful journey of questioning, grieving, and trying to hold on to hope. In the midst of the turmoil, one thing was clear. The investigation into Darryl's involvement in the crime was far from over. And with each new piece of evidence, the story of how Darryl's life had been turned upside down was just beginning to unfold. As the investigation into Darryl Miles' involvement in the case deepened, the cracks in the narrative against him began to appear. The mounting evidence that had seemed so damning at first, the burned-out car, the falsified documents, the ties to corrupt lenders, started to unravel under the weight of deeper scrutiny. It was clear that Darryl had not been the mastermind behind the crime. In fact, he had likely been a victim of a much larger scheme. But the question remained, how had he gotten caught up in it? enter the public defender assigned to Daryl's case, a young, determined lawyer with a reputation for tenacity. She had been tasked with a seemingly impossible job: to prove that Daryl was innocent, despite the overwhelming circumstantial evidence stacked against him. The odds were steep, but her commitment to justice pushed her forward. She began by reviewing the evidence that the prosecution had collected, taking a fresh look at the details that had initially appeared to tie Daryl to the crime. One of the first discrepancies she uncovered was the way the evidence had been handled by the authorities. The burned-out car, which had initially been linked to the missing banker, Victor Hill, had been found in Daryl's shop. But when the public defender reviewed the forensic reports, she discovered that key details about the car's origin had been overlooked. The vehicle had been destroyed in a way that made it nearly impossible to trace back to its original owner. Yet investigators had quickly assumed that it was Daryl's responsibility. This initial assumption, based on the car's discovery in his garage, set the stage for the investigation to focus squarely on Daryl as the primary suspect. But the more the public defender dug into the case, the more inconsistencies she found. She began to see patterns that didn't make sense. The missing banker, Victor Hill, had been entangled in a web of financial deceit and corruption long before he disappeared. Hill's connections to a group of corrupt lenders operating in the city raised serious questions about whether his disappearance had been part of a larger financial scheme, one that involved stolen cars, falsified documents, and the exploitation of vulnerable individuals desperate for loans. The more the lawyer dug into Hill's background, the more it became clear that Hill had been deeply involved in a network of criminal activities that had far-reaching implications. His ties to the automotive industry, including his dealings with a network of corrupt car dealerships and loan sharks, began to emerge as a central point in the investigation. The breakthrough came when the public defender discovered that Daryl's repair shop had been unknowingly roped into this network of corruption. While Daryl had never intended to become involved in the fraudulent activities, his shop had inadvertently become a key player in the laundering of stolen vehicles. The more the public defender investigated, the clearer it became that Daryl had been an unknowing participant, fixing and selling cars that had been obtained through illegal means. This was the critical revelation that shifted the focus of the investigation. As the truth began to unfold, the public defender worked tirelessly to uncover the full extent of the corruption that had infiltrated the city. She uncovered records that linked the corrupt lenders to several businesses across Detroit, all of which had played a role in the illegal car trade. It became apparent that the stolen vehicles were being funneled through various legitimate businesses, including auto repair shops like Daryl's, where they were repaired, resold, and laundered into the market. The scale of the operation was much larger than anyone had anticipated, and the web of deceit stretched all the way to the top. The deeper the investigation went, the more shocking the revelations became. It was clear that Daryl had been taken advantage of, caught up in a criminal underworld that he had never intended to be a part of. He had been an unwitting pawn in a much larger game, one that involved money laundering, stolen vehicles, and systemic corruption that had plagued Detroit for years. And yet, Despite all the evidence pointing to the existence of this larger conspiracy, Darrell had remained the central figure in the public eye, his name dragged through the mud, while the real criminals remained hidden in the shadows. As the public defender presented her findings, it became clear that Darrell's innocence was not just a matter of clearing his name. It was about exposing the truth behind the corruption that had infected the city. The authorities were slow to act on the revelations, but the public defender's relentless pursuit of justice led to a slow but steady shift in the case. With each new piece of evidence she uncovered, the narrative surrounding Darrell's involvement in the crime shifted from one of guilt to one of victimhood. The final revelation came when the investigation revealed the extent of the falsified documents and the roles played by the corrupt lenders in orchestrating the criminal activities. These lenders, whose names had been carefully hidden, were the true masterminds behind the operation. They had exploited not only Darrell, but also countless others who had unknowingly become part of their scheme. As the web of deceit unraveled, the focus shifted away from Darrell and onto those responsible for the criminal activities. Darrell's name, once tainted by suspicion, was slowly but surely cleared. But the road to redemption was far from easy. The revelations about the corrupt network not only exposed the criminal underworld, but also revealed the deep flaws in the system that had allowed such activities to thrive. For Darrell, the emotional toll of the investigation was immense. His life, his reputation, and his livelihood had been shattered, but the truth was finally coming to light. As the dust began to settle in the aftermath of Darrell Miles' exoneration, the full weight of the consequences rippled through the lives of everyone involved. For Darrell, the emotional toll of the ordeal was undeniable. His life, once built on trust, hard work, and community, had been shattered by accusations of a crime he didn't commit. The public's perception of him had been marred, and even though his name had been cleared, the scars remained. His repair shop, once a bustling hub in the neighborhood, had suffered irreparable damage. Business had dwindled in the wake of the scandal, and many customers who had once trusted him now looked elsewhere. Darrell's family, too, bore the emotional burden of the false accusations. Tanya, his wife, had stood by him through it all, fighting for his innocence even when the evidence seemed stacked against them. The strain on their relationship had been immense. The long nights spent trying to rebuild what had been torn apart by the criminal justice system had left their marriage strained, but stronger in some ways. They had always shared a deep bond, but the nightmare of the investigation had forced them to confront uncomfortable truths and rely on each other in ways they never had before. The emotional scars would take time to heal, but Tanya had never wavered in her belief in Darrell's innocence, and that unwavering loyalty became the foundation for their path forward. Yet the personal toll was just the beginning. The larger implications of the case would be felt far beyond Darrell's family. The investigation into the corrupt network of lenders, stolen vehicles, and falsified documents uncovered by the public defender revealed a disturbing pattern of exploitation that extended across Detroit and beyond. As Darrell's name was cleared, the focus shifted to those who had orchestrated the financial crimes. The authorities, finally taking action in response to the revelations, began a slow but deliberate process of uncovering the full scope of the conspiracy. Several individuals involved in the corrupt lending practices and illegal vehicle trading faced criminal charges, but for many, the consequences were not as severe as they should have been. The system that had allowed this corruption to flourish was exposed for its failure to protect individuals like Daryl, people who were innocent, yet caught up in the gears of a broken system. Daryl had been victimized not just by the criminals who had used his shop as a pawn in their operation, but by the very system that was supposed to protect him. The case revealed glaring gaps in oversight, accountability, and transparency. While some individuals were held accountable, the larger systemic issues remained largely unaddressed. The investigation served as a stark reminder of how easily the most vulnerable can be swept into the wake of a corrupt system, and how the truth often takes much longer to emerge than it should. For the community, the fallout was equally significant. Daryl had been a beloved figure, a trusted mechanic and friend. His arrest had shaken the very foundations of the neighborhood, causing many to question the trust they had placed in him. While his exoneration was a step toward justice, it did little to undo the damage that had been done to the relationships he had worked so hard to build. People were quick to judge him, and even quicker to turn their backs when the accusation was made. The community, once united by a shared sense of trust, found itself divided. Many wondered how they could have missed the signs of corruption, or if they had simply been too willing to overlook the deeper issues at play. As for Daryl, the emotional weight of this division was perhaps the hardest to bear. His innocence had been proven, but the damage to his reputation and the fractures in his relationships with neighbors and customers were not so easily repaired. He would spend the coming years rebuilding not just his business, but his standing in the community. Trust, once broken, was difficult to restore. The case had also left an indelible mark on the legal system. The young public defender, whose relentless pursuit of justice had led to the revelations that cleared Daryl's name, was hailed for her dedication. But her success in the case also underscored the shortcomings of the system. How so many innocent individuals are left vulnerable to manipulation, and how difficult it can be to navigate the legal labyrinth when the odds are stacked against you. For her, the case was a bittersweet victory. While Daryl's innocence had been proven, it was clear that the system that had failed him needed drastic reform. She would continue to fight for justice, but the weight of the injustice done to Daryl would stay with her for years to come. Reflecting on the broader picture, Daryl's case became a symbol of the flaws in both the legal system and the city's economic structure. It served as a reminder that no matter how hard someone works or how much trust they build within their community, the machinery of corruption can tear through a person's life in an instant. But it also showed the resilience of those who fight for truth. Daryl, Tanya, and their family had lived through hell, but they had emerged on the other side, battered but not broken. As we conclude this investigation into the wrongful accusations and eventual exoneration of Daryl Miles, we are reminded of the deep impact these cases have on real lives, on families, communities, and individuals. While Daryl's story is a powerful testament to resilience and perseverance, it is also a sobering reflection of the injustices that continue to plague the system. If you've been following this case and want to learn more about similar stories, or if you're passionate about justice and uncovering the truth, we invite you to subscribe to Beyond the Evidence. We'll continue to bring you cases like this, digging deep into the heart of the story and shedding light on the injustices that often go unnoticed. Your support allows us to keep pursuing the truth, one case at a time. Thank you for joining us on this journey. Don't forget to hit the subscribe button and share the story with others who care about justice.